Welcome to Office Hours, everyone. I'm Julian Zelizer of The Long View, and this is our weekly get-together, a little later than usual due to some commuting issues. Hope you can check out my foreign policy piece today. I think you'll really enjoy it with all the debates and controversies that are already swirling around the 250th celebration. There was a story I just saw in the Times about this organization that President Trump set up for fundraising. I wrote about 1976, the bicentennial, and a lot of the controversies from funding to the politics of the history that was celebrated or not even depicted from that period, and some changes since that time. So I think you'll really like that if you're history buffs and like to think about how previous events connect, differ, or where there's continuity with what we have today. So that's out in Foreign Policy today. My newsletter will drop. I know a lot of you enjoyed the conversation with Heather Thompson last Friday on the new book she has out about the Bernie Getz shooting in the 1980s and the ramifications of that and the politics of white rage. So that's online on the archives. And finally, um, this Friday, I have set up so far. Jonathan Cohn and I will be having a talk about various issues in healthcare then and now with John Alter, and perhaps I'll add another one. The Electoral College, there's a couple books on that. I believe there was a book by Jesse Wegman done a couple years ago that was quite good and had an overview, but let me check on that. Another book a lot of you might like, it's not simply on the Electoral College, it's more broadly on voting and the electoral system, is Alex Kesar's The Right to Vote, which is the most sweeping history we have. But let me look up that one. And I'm pretty sure it's Jesse Wegman, who wrote for the New York Times, wrote a very good book about that. But I hope I'm not misremembering. Anyway, office hours, you know the drill. And for those of you who are new, please, and thanks on the tie, please feel free to send in some questions or comments that I can build off of and respond to. This is your chance to ask me whatever's on your mind, and I will try to ask. Certainly, a lot of news is taking place. I assume, and we had a little pop culture and politics yesterday with the Bad Bunny halftime show. I am a football fan, so I was watching. I thought it was quite interesting, and there's a long history. I was just talking to my students about pop culture being an arena for political statements, political argument, and it's quite interesting. I was just teaching my students the other day. We were having a conversation about music in the 1970s and the rise of kind of heartland rock, Bruce Springsteen, John Cougar Mellencamp, and some others, and this appeal to working Americans, how it was used in different ways, which was interesting. Most famously, many of you might know that Born in the USA, which came out in '84, Ronald Reagan uses the anthem for his campaign as a kind of patriotic um, uh, uh, music in his mind because of the theme, the chorus. But obviously, the song is really a protest song against Vietnam, and Springsteen wouldn't play it, and he'd play it in the acoustic version. So there's a really interesting history of this and the complexities of how these performances, music, and others are interpreted and used in different ways, and the musician can't always control that. Often, some protest in pop culture is very explicit, and a lot of the 60s music or a song like Ohio in 1970, which we discussed a few weeks ago after Kent State, is very direct. Some of it is more subtle. Some of it is about the performer themselves, just who they are. There's a really interesting history of female singer-songwriters in the 1970s who are breaking through the industry, but it's an industry very much tied and connected and revolving around male performers and all kinds of issues with radio stations and record labels, and simply their ability to break through. People like Bonnie Raitt and obviously Joni Mitchell and Carole King in themselves become a statement about popular culture, regardless of the words. And there's just a long history of this. Again, not just in music, and the Super Bowl itself has its own particular line of history with these performances becoming wrapped up, such as Beyonce's. And last night fit into that. And it's interesting to read some of the conversations taking place after the performance, and criticism and praise. And obviously, for many people, one of the most powerful moments was at the end when he said, and I hope I get this right, God bless America. And then he started listing all of the countries in the Americas. And there were many moments. So, anyways, it was just, I think, relevant to see last night in a very long history of this, and musicians who have tried to use that space, for better or worse, to make a statement about where the nation is politically, and the intersection is always with that and commercial, very real commercial pressures that musicians face. Obviously, some are doing very well and have a little kind of leeway, but the political problems and fallout can be also quite severe. And so you have these artists balancing those two imperatives. There's an imperative, really, for a lot of musicians, I think, in our polarized political age, to stay away from this and avoid losing a large part of the market, or becoming the subject of politics, or finding themselves the target of the president of the United States. On the other hand, I think it's hard for many of them not to say something about what has been going on in places like Minneapolis, or more broadly with immigration and much more. I saw a comment. I know a lot of people are talking about the nationalization of elections that President Trump uh, referred to the other day, and I'm happy to speak about that a little. And that is a focus of my newsletter tomorrow. But I think that raised a lot of alarms, or set off many alarms, when he talked in the interview, not just about nationalizing the elections, which I think it's getting muddied in the conversation, but it was particularly in 15 areas. And I assume the reference is 15 areas where he has lost, and not nationalizing the election, but that Republicans should take over the election. So it was a very specific comment. Obviously, elections are under the jurisdiction of really localities. That's in the Constitution. States and local government have authority over the election system, not the federal government. There is a history, of course, in the Constitution. Congress does have the power to intervene more expansively, but that is through acts of legislation. And the history of federal intervention, the biggest has been the involvement of the federal government in protecting the right to vote. Of course, that was not a partisan um, kind of legislation, meaning it wasn't Democrats should take over where Republicans were. It was actually a Democratic Congress and Democratic president talking about the Deep South, which was controlled by Democrats at the time. But it wasn't about partisan control. It was about an area of national control. The 65 Voting Rights Act was an act of Congress, so it fit into the constitutional system. It was not through executive fiat, which really does not square at all with what the Constitution says. And finally, it was very specific and refined in terms of when and how the federal government would intervene, not a kind of blanket statement about the federal government taking over or somehow just having total control. This was in the case where there was evidence, statistical evidence, that voting rights had been abridged. And most important, the legislation aimed to protect voting when voting was being denied, and that was the intention, rather than some very vague and broad effort, which would allow one party to have control over the system. So I think those differences are really important because you're going to hear more, I assume, of when the national government has been part of election. I know there's a lot of kind of criticism of Democrats who, in recent years, or liberals who have called for a stronger national role in the election system, especially in light of 2020. But that's still the context in which most of the work by good scholars and proponents of this has fallen under, as opposed to what we heard. So I think there's rightly a lot of concern. I don't think this is a isolated the comments not an isolated incident. You obviously had the FBI with Gabbard there taking control of ballots, which is really a pretty dramatic step without any kind of justification. And of course, you just have a long history from the administration of challenging this. So I think the election is going to work on two levels at this point. One is the normal midterm election struggle and issue. And yes, Don, let me just add, and I'll come back to my 2 points, is that Steve Bannon also has been very vociferous about ICE agents being used in the context of the elections and going after voting areas, which will be an act of intimidation. So I think you have the normal election debate, which is not insignificant, about how the balance of power will be affected. I think there's a lot of evidence Democrats might do quite well if current conditions continue. But then in this election, and it's in the shadow of 2020, the process itself is just as much of an issue. And I think there's going to have to be a lot of attention to protecting the process and to avoiding this kind of federal intervention. And it will not be easy. On the other hand, it doesn't mean it will inevitably happen. And we've even seen off-year elections happen. But the stakes are quite high. There are midterms that matter. All midterms matter, but there's midterms that matter a lot more. And I think we're at a crossroads where what happens here will either entrench and legitimate a kind of Trumpian conservative vision of American politics, and allow for a very non-guardrail type of presidential power to continue, or we will see some restoration. Again, it will be limited, but there will be powers worth everything in Washington, and it would mean a great deal if the Democrats had control of the House and Senate, which I think is why the president is ramping up his rhetoric right now. It's not coincidental, and it's not without him understanding the consequences of what he may face. So I think those are the two lines that here in this conversation and others that they'll have to that's how we have to think of the midterms. So we've talked about popular culture. We've talked about the midterm elections. I saw the comment on Fox News. And that's another area which is really, I think, important. The conservative media ecosystem has changed a lot. I just read a book that I do recommend, and I should try to get the author about Tucker Carlson. It's a biography of his rise to power within the media. It's quite good, and I think part of how the book works is not just the story about Carlson, but it's about, especially just in the last 5 years or so, how not just media generally is changing, but conservative media has really changed. In that moment when Fox dominated American political debate, I would argue, from the mid 1990s, late 1990s, really. It goes on the air in 96. And it's by the late 90s and then in the early 2000s it takes off. I think some of that is eroding. It's still a very powerful platform. Yes, I can put that on the chat. Let me do that after and give you the exact title. But I think we are seeing much more in the podcasting space, in independent journalism space, in YouTube shows, as you all know. And I think it's kind of it's very relevant and important how the parties adjust to these platforms, and those platforms will change again. It's important not to get stuck on it, but we saw with Carlson, who after getting uh, fired essentially from Fox, is able to remake his entire career and arguably expand it through the convergence of both his figuring out this new platform and how these new platforms work, much less structured and much less centralized, combined with direct appeal to President Trump. And it's not unlike the story that you can learn about of how Rush Limbaugh came to power. Limbaugh was an unsuccessful radio host. His talk radio show takes off after 1987. It's after the Federal Communication Commission dismantles the Fairness Doctrine, and it's a period between 88 to 94 when talk radio just proliferates. And you also have a period where you have more companies trying to get buying up radio stations all over the country and trying to find national personalities who can broadcast not simply in one city or one locality, but all over. And that ranges from Don Imus and Howard Stern to much kind of more pointed political figures such as Rush Limbaugh. And um, what's equally important is Rush uh, basically forms an alliance with the emerging Republican coalition that will win control of Congress in 1994 under the direction of Newt Gingrich, who I've written about in Burning Down the House. And there's really, I think, fascinating stories of how, as this majority is taking hold, they turn to talk radio to communicate their message. They go so far, the leadership, as to tell Rush what the issues they are going to focus on in a given day. So there's some kind of coordination. And so I think even though the media has changed a lot and we're not in that era anymore, I do think those two elements, understanding the platform and connecting the platform to party politics, is exactly what's happening. And there is an open question politically if Democrats can catch up to that. And there's some work that has been done, and some broadcasts are reaching people, but it's still not clear to me that there is not a big asymmetry in the scale and scope of what the media can reach. And ultimately, in politics, the message matters. And um, so I think that is a third topic. Let me take my break and thank all the subscribers for joining now and joining as I post this afterwards. And secondly, paid subscribers, a special thanks for everyone who I know tough times, but gives their support to the long view and allows me to do the work to bring you all these interviews and the writing and all the work that entails behind the scenes. I appreciate your support very, very much. And as I always say, independent journalism requires paid subscribers. That's how this works. There's no commercials, no organizational infrastructure. And I hope some of you might consider upgrading your subscriptions to paid to allow me to continue this. The fourth estate, I think, Tricia, it's not there. It's just very different than it used to be. And yes, all right, thanks for doing that, Greg. It's the Jason Zengerle's book that I read, and I do really recommend that. Let me try to get him on the long view if he is available. But the state of the news has become an issue that is kind of concerning on many levels. I think one is I do think thus the openly political nature of a lot of news has eroded some of the trust and even quality of the information people can have. Ultimately, in my mind, what you really want to do with good news is to provide people with information and analysis and let them then make the choice. And you have to be very careful that the news, like history, is not slanted in a way that reflects the bias of the institution or the people giving it. I think the commercial pressures we have seen that grew in news since the 80s are a very big issue. And I think they are converging now with the administration, and that is the point of political pressure. Those commercial interests that aren't always just about the news are a weakness for the ownership of the news and are being leveraged to get away from some kinds of coverage. And internally, the commercial pressures of news it starts, some argue, with Craigslist back in the 1980s and 90s, taking over the classified sections of newspapers, which is how newspapers until the 80s made a lot of their money. On cable television, you have networks where news is the business, viewership and advertising is how money is made, as opposed to the older days when you had family owned newspapers or you had television news that was just part of a bigger network that made its money other ways, and it was a public service. And so I think those three areas, and I would add, I guess, the social media world has created an ecosystem where disinformation is just very easy, filterless, unedited information, some false, some wrong, just very easy to get out there. And not just get out there, but get into the national conversation. So as we head into these elections, while people are cynical and frustrated with news, equally important is to focus attention on what we need. Without that kind of information, without that kind of public commons, I think democracy erodes very, very fast. Democracy depends on the vote. It depends on the electoral process. Depends on representative institutions, but it also depends on good news. And so, I think thank you, Tricia, for raising that, and Don. I think that's something we need to keep our eye on. Okay, we're at the end of our time. Thank you for joining. Tomorrow, for paid subscribers, I will do in the classroom around 10 o'clock. It'll be in the newsletter when it drops in the morning. Thanks for joining, everyone. Have a great day. Stay warm, and we'll talk again very soon.